The voice of the fathers and AMP, the healing of the soul. Welcome back. If you have been with us from the beginning of this study on Genesis chapter 22 verse 19, you already know that the seemingly simple verse, the quiet closing line of the great Akedah narrative, the binding of Isaac, is anything but simple. In our first study, we walked through the Hebrew text word by word, discovering the resurrection silence around Isaac, the covenant weight of Beersheba, the theology of return encoded in the verb shuv, and the invitation to settle in the promises of God. If you have not seen that first study, I encourage you to go back and watch it, because what we are building here is cumulative. Every layer adds to the one beneath it. Today we go deeper. We are going to listen to the great voices of the ancient church, the patristic theologians who read this verse in their own era and found in it a map to the heart of God. Then we are going to turn inward, into the psychological and healing dimensions of this text, because this verse does not only speak to the intellect. It speaks to the wounded places in the human soul. It speaks to the places where we have felt the knife raised over what we love. It speaks to the places where we have waited at the foot of the mountain, unsure whether to expect return. It speaks to those places, and it brings healing. Open your heart. This is the second movement of our journey into Genesis chapter 22 verse 19. Origen of Alexandria was a 3rd century biblical theologian of extraordinary brilliance and audacious spiritual imagination. He was the first systematic Christian commentator on the Old Testament, and his homilies on Genesis, written in the early 3rd century, represent the first extended Christian attempt to read the Akedah as a full typological anticipation of the passion and resurrection of Christ. For Origen, every detail of Genesis chapter 22 is a prophetic picture. Isaac is Christ. The wood carried up the mountain is the cross carried up Golgotha. The 3-day journey is the 3 days of death and burial. The ram caught in the thicket, with its horns entangled in thorns, is the divine Son whose head was crowned with a wreath of thorns. And the return to Beersheba, for Origen, is the return to the community of the covenant after the sacrifice, the beginning of the post-resurrection mission of the church. But what Origen notices, with his characteristic perceptive intensity, is the communal dimension of the return. It is not only Abraham who goes back. The servants arise. They all go together. For Origen, these servants represent those who were waiting in the shadows of the old covenant, those who could not yet ascend to the full light of the sacrifice but who nevertheless were faithful in their waiting. And when Abraham comes back to them and goes with them to Beersheba, Origen sees in this the preaching of the gospel, the descent of the apostolic witness from the heights of resurrection encounter into the community of all who had been waiting in hope. The fruit of the mountain is not kept on the mountain. It is brought down to those who waited below. The fruit of the cross, the resurrection, the new life in Christ, is brought down from Calvary by the apostles and poured out in the community of the early church. And it is given first to those who had been waiting most faithfully. Augustine of Hippo, bishop of the North African city of Hippo Regius in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, and perhaps the single most influential theologian in the history of Western Christianity, treats the Akedah in his magnum opus The City of God and in his shorter questions on Genesis. For Augustine, the entire narrative is what he calls res gestae prophetica, a historical event that is simultaneously a prophetic utterance. The history is real. Abraham was a real man, Isaac was a real child. The mountain was a real place. But the events that occurred there were arranged by divine providence to serve as a living prophecy of the central event of all human history, the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. For Augustine, the most moving part of the return to Beersheba is its ordinariness. After the extraordinary encounter on the mountain, Abraham goes back to servants. He makes a journey through the desert. He settles in a town. Augustine sees in this ordinariness the deeply important theological truth that grace does not transport the believer out of ordinary life. It transforms ordinary life from within. Abraham does not become a supernatural being after Moriah. He becomes a transformed man living an ordinary life. He walks through the same desert he walked before. He returns to the same servants. He settles in the same town. But everything is different because he himself is different. The person who has been through the fire of total surrender to God inhabits the same world with a different soul. And that, for Augustine, is the hope of the Christian life. Not escape from the ordinary. Transformation within it. John Chrysostom, the golden-mouthed preacher of Antioch and later Constantinople, whose sermons on the scriptures were so electrifying that congregations applauded during the preaching and wept at the end, focuses in his homilies on Genesis on the interior life of Abraham in this verse. Chrysostom is the master of the psychological and emotional interior of the biblical characters. He does not merely report what happened. He inhabits the characters and describes what they must have felt and experienced from the inside. For Chrysostom, Abraham descending from the mountain is a man walking in the afterglow of the most intense spiritual encounter any human being had ever experienced short of Moses at the burning bush. He has just been at the razor edge of total obedience. He has just heard the voice of God from heaven speaking his name twice. He has just experienced the miracle of divine provision at the last possible moment. And now he must walk down the mountain and go back to normal life. Chrysostom describes this transition with extraordinary empathy. He says that the truly great soul is not the one who can ascend the mountain in a blaze of supernatural intensity. The truly great soul is the one who can come back down again and walk in faithfulness through the ordinary. The measure of Abraham's greatness, for Chrysostom, is not the height of his ascent but the steadiness of his return. Chrysostom also draws deeply on the emotional significance of Abraham returning to his servants and going with them, together, Yajdav, to Beersheba. He preaches that the servant who sees his master return from the mountain and immediately perceives, even without words, that something extraordinary has happened, that servant is blessed. And the master who honors his servants with his return, who does not leave them wondering, who comes back to them and gathers them up and walks with them, that master embodies the heart of God toward humanity. God does not leave his people waiting forever at the foot of the mountain. He returns to them. He gathers them. He goes with them, together, into the life of the covenant. Ambrose of Milan, the brilliant bishop whose preaching had such force that it drew crowds who had come only to criticize and send them away transformed, writes in his De Abraham about the spiritual rhythm that Genesis chapter 22 verse 19 encodes. Ambrose, who was himself a bishop with enormous pastoral and administrative responsibilities, understood well the tension between the contemplative and the active life. He had been a Roman provincial governor before being unexpectedly acclaimed as bishop by the crowd of Milan, and he brought that experience of public responsibility into his theology. For Ambrose, the movement of Genesis chapter 22 is the perfect model of what he calls the alternation of the two lives, the vita contemplativa, the contemplative life of prayer and encounter with God, and the vita activa, the active life of service and community and ordinary work. Abraham ascends in contemplation. He descends in action. The ascent is necessary. Without the mountain, the valley has no meaning. Without the encounter with God at the summit, the return to the servants is merely the return of an old man to his tent. But with the encounter, the return is a radiant thing. Abraham goes back to his servants carrying something they could not see but could somehow sense. He goes back to them carrying the name of God, Jehovah Jireh, the God who sees and provides. He goes back carrying the covenant renewal, the reaffirmation of the promise that through his seed all the nations of the earth would be blessed. He descends in action, but he descends full of the contemplation. And Ambrose says that this is the calling of every Christian who has been on the mountain with God, to come back down full, and to pour out in service what was received in prayer. Gregory Palamas, the 14th century Byzantine theologian of the Eastern Orthodox tradition, whose theology of the divine uncreated energies was vindicated by the Council of Constantinople in 1351 and became the formal theological expression of Orthodox mysticism, would read this verse through the transformative lens of theosis, the divinization of the human person through participation in God's energies. For Palamas, the God who spoke from heaven and provided the ram was not the unknowable divine essence, which is forever beyond human comprehension. He was the active divine energies, the self-communication of God in love and power into the sphere of human experience. Abraham on the mountain encountered the divine energies in their fullness. And when he descended, he carried those energies with him. He was different. His flesh and blood were unchanged. His social position was unchanged. The servants were still his servants and the desert was still the desert. But within him, something of the uncreated light had been deposited. Something of the divine fire had taken up residence. And his settlement in Beersheba, his dwelling in the place of the oath, was the dwelling of a man who now carried within him a permanent deposit of theosis, of divine life. This is what the Orthodox tradition calls the fruits of prayer and ascetic discipline. The person who has genuinely encountered God does not return from that encounter the same. They carry within them something of the divine glory, not as a possession but as a participation, not as something they achieved but as something they received. And this participation then radiates quietly into everything they do, into their community, into their work, into their dwelling, into their ordinary life in Beersheba. Now let us turn from the great voices of the tradition to the wounded heart, because this verse speaks not only to the theological mind but to the psychological soul. And it speaks there with tremendous power and tenderness. What Abraham has just experienced, measured against the categories of modern trauma psychology, is an acute catastrophic stressor of the most extreme possible intensity. Consider what the 3 days from Beersheba to Moriah must have been like in Abraham's body and nervous system. The command to sacrifice his son did not arrive and get executed in a single moment. He had 3 days. 3 days to cut the wood. 3 days to load the donkey. 3 days to travel through the desert with his only son at his side, knowing what he had been asked to do. 3 days of eating bread and drinking water and sleeping under the stars with the knife at his belt and the command in his mind. 3 days of dissociation, of the mind doing what it must to survive in unbearable reality, keeping the surface functional while the depth screamed. The brilliant trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk, in his landmark work The Body Keeps the Score, demonstrates that the body physically stores the physiological response to traumatic experience. The nervous system moves into a state of hyperarousal or shutdown, the muscles hold tension, the breath becomes shallow, the digestive system contracts, the sleep architecture is disrupted. All of this happens automatically, below the level of conscious choice, as the body's protective systems respond to overwhelming threat. Abraham's body, over those 3 days, would have been in a state of profound physiological distress, regardless of the steadiness of his faith. Faith and physiology are not enemies, but they operate on different levels. His faith said, God will provide. His body said, this is a death march. And then the moment of rescue. The angel's voice. The ram in the thicket. The sudden release of the held breath. The overwhelming surge of relief. In neurobiological terms, the moment of rescue after extreme anticipated harm produces one of the most powerful neurochemical events the human body can experience. The cortisol and adrenaline that had flooded his system for 3 days began to clear. The parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest system, began to reassert itself. Abraham named the place. Abraham called it Jehovah Jireh. And then he descended. The return to his servants in verse 19 is, from the perspective of trauma recovery, the first step of what Peter Levine, the developer of somatic experiencing therapy, calls the discharge and completion of the threatened response. Levine has shown through decades of clinical work that trauma is not primarily a psychological injury. It is a biological incompletion. When the body prepares for a catastrophic threat and then the threat is resolved, the body needs to complete the arousal cycle through social engagement, through physical movement, through the re-establishment of safe connection. Abraham's return to his servants, his walking with them together through the desert, his settlement in Beersheba, are not merely narrative details. They are the biological completion of the trauma response. They are the body coming back to regulation through movement and community in the establishment of a safe home. John Bowlby, the founder of attachment theory, described what he called the secure base, the relational and environmental foundation from which the human person can venture into the world and to which they can return for comfort and grounding after stress. For Abraham, Beersheba was his secure base. It was the place he knew. It was the place where the covenant had been enacted, where the tree had been planted, where the name of God had been called upon. To return to Beersheba was to return to the secure base, to the place of relational safety and covenantal identity. And the act of settling there, of dwelling there with intention and permanence, was the act of a man who understood, at some deep level, that healing comes not through constant movement and escape but through the establishment of a safe and rooted place. Now let us make this personal. Because you are not just studying a historical figure. You are listening to a word that is addressed to your own soul. Perhaps you have carried something for 3 days. Perhaps you have carried it for 3 years. Perhaps the knife that was raised over your life was not made of iron but of diagnosis or divorce or disappointment or death. Perhaps you have been walking through your own Negev desert, through a dry season where the water skins were running low and the destination was unclear and the weight of what you were carrying was almost more than you could bear. This verse speaks to you. Yeshov. Abraham turned and came back. And the God who met him on the mountain was waiting for him in the ordinary. The God who provided the ram in the thicket was the same God who had planted the tree at Beersheba and promised the oath. He was already there in the ordinary, waiting for Abraham to return to it. You do not have to stay on the mountain. The mountain was not Abraham's permanent dwelling. Beersheba was. The extraordinary encounter was not meant to be his permanent address. The settled, covenant-grounded, community-connected ordinary was. And that is where the healing happens. Not in the perpetual intensity of the summit, but in the slow, steady, rooted life of the valley, in the community of the servants, in the shade of the tamarisk tree, by the water of the covenant well. Receive these affirmations as living words from the Spirit of God. Say them slowly. Let them move past the surface of your mind and into the deep places. I give myself permission to come down from the mountain and return to ordinary life. The encounter I had with God on my mountain is real and permanent. I carry it with me into every ordinary moment. I am not alone in my return. God has placed people around me, my near, my companions, with whom I am called to go together into the covenant life. I will not carry my mountain experience in isolation. My body is allowed to heal. My nervous system is allowed to settle. God is not asking me to stay in a state of perpetual crisis intensity. He is inviting me to dwell, to yashv, to be at home in His covenant peace. The place of the oath is my home. The promises of God over my life are not distant or uncertain. They are the ground beneath my feet, the tree above my head, the water in the well. I settle into them today. That is the second movement of our Genesis chapter 22 verse 19 study. We have heard the great fathers of the church. We have walked through the psychological terrain of surrender and return. We have felt the healing that this verse carries for the wounded soul. In our third and final study, we will scale the highest peak of all, the Christ-centered typological synthesis, where every detail of this verse is traced to its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus Christ, in the cross, in the resurrection, in the coming of the Spirit, and in the eternal covenant life of the Church. Do not miss that final study. Like this video right now so you can find it again. Subscribe to this channel and share this teaching with someone who needs to hear the word that God provides and that He calls us home. You can reach us at christ4life143@gmail.com. We love hearing from you. Stay tuned for the next video. Join us next time as we continue verse by verse.